All right, so again, you're seeing nonlinear narratives coming back. You're also seeing collage of radically different people moving in continuous kind of synchronized movement. You know what I mean? So it's that's kind of something I wanted to sort of deal with in the questions section. But on the other hand, it's crucial to remember the notion of collage, whether it was John Hartfeld in the 20s or Hannah Hoch, or even the bricolage work of Picasso or a couple other people. Duchamp, of course, finding the ready-made or using that kind of stuff. These are now issues that have kind of been absorbed by pop culture and have kind of become literally the whole fabric of the creative process of late 20th century cultural production. So whether it's from the art to the avant-garde moving into mass culture, or whether it's mass culture moving into the art world, you're seeing more and more of a kind of a diffusion of the boundaries between the two. And that's kind of why we wanted to play that one, because it's critiquing surveillance and TV images, stuff like that. But it also has a great sense of humor, and that's what any artist, I think, kind of needs to deal with right these days. So, to make a long story short, anybody have any questions? It's open there, open ballgame. Sure.
Do you feel that your art has any inherent meaning?
Interesting. No, it's a good point. At this point in the ballgame, meaning itself is up for grabs, because on a lot of levels, if you look at someone like Mariko Mori, who's a pretty major art world star right now, or Matthew Barney, these people are dealing with this kind of intense implosion into like self. They're looking at their own kind of mythologies, if you will, and sort of creating whole micro universes around their own stuff. My meaning comes from myself as an artist in a way, and so I'm just kind of looking at that as a sense of like art as continuous selection. Even the notion of Jamaica, where they call the DJ the selector. Its meaning is in the sense of how it goes out into the world and how other people use and reconfigure it. So like in a certain sense, I find my art becomes like a tool or a part of the process of creating other art. So perhaps it is meaningless in the sense of like, it's like software for cultural production. Like the records themselves become their own kind of generative syntax. So meaning becomes language almost, because this is our own, it's like Lego blocks, it's building blocks, and people put things together however they will. I actually like the idea of making records for other people to use. The artwork becomes a tool.
I guess, like, I was reading an interview, and they were placing a lot of emphasis on deconstruction, which of course disseminates any sort of meaning within any actual text, be whatever the text is. So I guess this is more of a general question, but just to put it back to yourself, how do you find your art, why is it worthwhile if it doesn't have meaning? Of course, this is a question you can ask of anything with deconstruction,
right?
More specifically yourself.
Well, that has a whole kind of issue with this notion of cultural relativism that's going on in the academy at the moment. Like, I don't know if you guys remember, there was a kind of a big controversial thing. There was a guy named Alan D. Sokal that published an essay in Social Text last year. Do you remember that? He used all these kind of high-end theory terms about physics, and then revealed that it was a hoax later in lingua franca. So it was like the gravitational syntax, and blah, 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 decentralizes the blah. It's a classic essay. If you ever get a chance, you got to read it. It's really funny. It's online at socialtext.com. But yeah, it was the essay was absolute gibberish. He was kind of, but because he had been using a language that was already established, he made his own remix of the situation, which at this point, ask any DJ anywhere, the music is kind of like an emotional extension of their own value structure. Like, people get a kick out of hearing certain styles. That's what it becomes a pleasurable situation. Like, to just, most people I know who are DJs just like kind of getting into the mix and just jamming around. And the audience themselves is actually more conservative usually than the DJ, because most people are doing it because they really like it. So I guess in a certain sense, it's the gravitational pull is in kind of like the sense of playfulness and pleasure. But on the other hand, deconstruction, you're right, it deals with these notions of both surveillance on one hand, when you look at Virilio, but he wouldn't, all these terms are being used very loosely. So you can look at Virilio, Foucault, Bars, Derrida, and in a certain sense, all these people play with language. It's a whole French kind of deconstruction ballgame. But then again, if you look at hip hop, that's how people play with language as well. They flip the script. That's even a classic sort of term. So language has always been, in a certain sense, of a lot of African American narratives. Like Brewer Rabbit, for example, is from the South. This character that could go up and like crack a joke and sort of always play with games, with people and trick people. But then you also look at Bugs Bunny, who inherited that out of the kind of media sphere. But late 20th century culture, I mean, it's an issue I always actually want to ask the audience. I mean, most of my friends who go into art galleries or museums right now, there's a sense of flux. Like the values that are being thrown at you from art no longer really have the same gravitational pull as even watching a video game or a cool movie or something, And that's a big issue in terms of generational appreciation of visual culture. I have friends that don't even go to museums anymore. They're like, I can just see the photograph. Who cares to see the original? And it's like, wow, that kind of is pretty mind-blowing for my friends who are older. But I kind of I feel like I'm at a crossroads in a way. Like even the notion of the real object, what is real, what has meaning. These are issues that the artists, like I have friends who are musicians that feel that DJing is not real and has no meaning. But then you go to a nightclub or you go to a party where someone's cutting and scratching and really breaking something down and the crowd's cheering. So it's like a social process, but it's an unconscious process because most people wouldn't go out of their way, like me, to burden themselves with all this theory baggage and everything. They just kind of, they just do it. So, yeah, what do you feel in terms of meaning? I mean, I'm curious. It's a conversation. So.
Well, I guess one thing people are doing in literature right now is looking towards past postmodernism, which is basically what I'm talking about, and saying the only worthwhile thing now is basically creating metafictions or meta-narratives, as in you can't create anything new, so you might as well use past things like collage, pastiche. So that's basically what you're doing. Of course, the problem is that postmodernism rejects all meta-narratives because you can't have a grand narrative. So does that just make it simply worthless, or are you just creating something like that essay, which is nothing more than a trick and a ruse, and there's nothing else really going on at all?
Well, you can, doesn't it seem like most of the TV you watch is full of shit anyway as well? The news, the media, everything seems to be kind of a fiction at this point. Like in the U.S., we're bombarded, say for example, with the biggest soap opera in the U.S. history, which is the Lewinsky trial, and that's got thousands of pages of footnotes. It's the Star Report, Stargate, at this point. It's meaning is as how you can consensually create or create the fiction to the point where most people think it's real. And the media in the U.S. has been ahead of the rest of the planet by about 50 years in terms of fabrications. There's a great movie called Parallax View, which came out in the late 60s, which is about sort of media and like kind of myths and stuff like that, but it has a precise trajectory about control and brainwashing and stuff like that. And it's at this point, ask any hacker, for example. They have a thing what they call social engineering, where if they want to get into a system, they'll call and pretend as they're part of the hierarchy and say, hey, we're having a problem down in room 501. What's the password for whatever? And because they're using the right language, they're able to access the person, and so the person usually thinks that they're part of the narrative, and then they get the password and then steal all the information later. But it's an interesting thing in terms of the late 20th century. There's no standard situation, so it's all just a flux of games and within games. Like when I watch the news, you realize the U.S. is kind of going through an attempted coup d'état. Basically, to put it bluntly. And it's viewed as was the president smoke? What brand of cigar was the president smoking while he was? That's at this point. Might as well be a James Bond narrative where, the advertising on everything Bond wears, whether it's the watch or the tie. They had a whole thing about what tie Clinton was wearing. So does that have meaning?